Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 345. This week the questions are taken from Guide 417 on the BK-1124 class river gunboats of the Soviet Union and the Wednesday video on naval engineering, the false dawn of iron ships. So let's begin with questions. Scott Giles asks, how well would a BK-1124 have fared against a US Civil War era monitor? Although on the face of it a silly question, the wildly different levels of technology make it hard for me to pick a clear winner. It is actually a bit of an odd one, because, I mean, obviously there's a lot of different US Civil War monitor types, but it's actually a much closer fight than you might think. Now, obviously, if the BK-1124 gets hit by 11-inch or 15-inch Dahlgren shot, or probably considering its shape, size and armour were still shell, it's probably going to be obliterated or severely damaged very, very quickly. So it's a little bit of a glass cannon. However, the guns are actually remarkably capable against Civil War era monitor armour. Now, it does depend on what armour you're going up against and what guns you're using. Because if you're taking a more typical BK-1124 that has the 76mm guns on the T-34 tank turrets, as you can see here, that, at least on paper, if you use one of the more common calculation steps between, iron, compound, Harvey, Krupp, etc., if you take its penetration values against World War II era tank steel and then retro-calculate back to iron, it turns out that the 76mm can, in theory, just about penetrate Monitor's turret, which is 8 inches of lamellar plates, because the penetration value against iron comes out to somewhere between 7 and 8 inches, and of course lamellar armour, when it comes to resisting shot, as we know, is weaker. So you'd just about be able to punch through Monitor with a 76mm gun. And some of the later ammunition types on the 76mm are a little bit more capable than that still. However, of course, Monitor is the first US monitor. Some other US monitors are more heavily armoured on the turret, but the flip side is that their belt protection, such as it is usually less well protected than that. So you would be able to get 76mm rounds through there. And, of course, the 76mm gun is a lot more accurate and a lot more rapid firing than the 11-inch and 15-inch Dahlgrens. Now, if you go up to the later versions, some of which would have the T-34-85 turret, the 85mm gun, far more than enough penetration. I mean, it's got like 3 inches and a bit penetration at the kind of battle ranges you'd expect for this kind of fight anyway against tank steel, and retro-calculating that back up to iron, there is no US monitor that has enough armour to stop an 85mm shell. The weakness of this type of engagement, though, is obviously going to be the monitor is going to be, generally speaking, the larger vessel. So putting a bunch of solid shot anti-tank rounds into it may or may not do a huge amount. I mean, if you've got the penetration to get through the turret armour, then obviously you can probably knock out the people manning the guns pretty quickly, especially if you've got the 85mm version. And you probably do a reasonable amount of damage even with the 76mm gun, simply through spalling and fragmentation and everything, plus, as I said, the rate of fire. But in all honesty, you'd be much better off in one of these BK river gunboats firing at the waterline and punching a bunch of holes in it, because monitors don't float very well once they start to take water in. And you have lots of chances to do that, as I said, because of the rate of fire and the accuracy of the guns comparative to what the monitors are carrying. But the flip side, of course, as I said, is that if the monitors see these things coming, and if they do manage to get off a couple of salvos, one hit, especially with an 11 or 15-inch shell particularly, and these things are gone. Gamo Master asks, will you one day cover the naval battles of the War of the Triple Alliance, in particular the Ironclads, as I think Brazil's River Ironclad fleet is extremely underrated? It's definitely something on my list of things to do, as, for those of you who understand what I'm about to say, mi capacidad para leer español es mucho mejor que mi capacidad para hablar español. But there are two problems. Firstly, Brazil obviously speaks Portuguese, so the fact that I can read Spanish is less helpful when it comes to Brazilian sources. And secondly, it's finding those sources in the first place. Because yes, there are a few English language sources about the War of the Triple Alliance, but not that many. So ideally, I would like to find, well, South American sources, so Spanish and Portuguese written sources regarding the War of the Triple Alliance, particularly the naval element. So if you're listening and you happen to know of some of those titles and their authors, then please let me know. And I can see about getting my hands on some of them, and then I'll be able to, hopefully make a much better sourced video, because if there's anything that I've learned exploring the various naval battles around South America, it's that even if you think you have a pretty decent English language source, very often, in a way very similar to what happened with Midway, and for ages with people going, yes, well, this one Japanese guy has said that the flight decks of the Japanese carriers at Midway were packed with aircraft, and everyone's like, okay, well, that's a translated Japanese language source. He must know what he's talking about. We'll go with that. And then it turns out actually he was pretty much the only one saying that, and everybody else said different. It's kind of a similar thing in that there are some English language sources that are either directly translated or have taken their sourcing from someone who has translated some accounts in one way or another. But because they're obviously mostly written by authors who don't necessarily understand Spanish, and in this case Portuguese as well, themselves, they've kind of had to take it a little bit on faith, and you sometimes end up with similar situations. Like, for example, what happened when in the battle where the Peruvian ironclad Huascar was captured by the Chileans. Now, according to the relatively few English language sources that cover that battle in any kind of detail, the battle went one way. However, it seems that if you mention this to either Chileans or Peruvians, they will usually, if they're informed about their country's naval history, inform you very quickly that this is not, in fact, how the battle went, and it went somewhat differently. I mean, the overall outcome was the same, but who shot at who and for how long and who was more or less damaged, all of that, very, very different story. So that's why I want to try and find, if you like, local language sources, which, as I said, if you know some, please let me know in the comments below. However, I will add one caveat to that, which is, if possible, please link me to local language sources that are actually written in a manner that is at least somewhat academic, sources cited, and presents a explainable narrative of what's going on. Because the one thing, and admittedly this is more to do with, if you like, mainland Spanish, so Spain Spanish sources, as opposed so much to South American sources, but I have noted it, is that quite a number of Spanish language books about various subjects, unfortunately, I would say, maybe it's a cultural thing, but they seem to approach it with a less than academic way of doing things. Now, often there will be some useful sections in those books where they are taking an academic approach and actually telling you what happened with their sources. But a large amount of some of those works essentially consists of, well, these other people, usually English-speaking historians, say this happened, but it didn't, and they're so stupid and they're so ignorant, and why are we listening to these people? And you kind of end up with 2 or 3 chapters of polemic about how dumb the gringo historians are, essentially, and essentially doing the literary equivalent of pointing and laughing at them while going, oh, you look at all these people, they don't know anything about our history, how could they possibly say this, blah blah. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, okay, I got that in the first 3 paragraphs. I do not need 3 chapters of this. If you want to tell me that whoever has written about this previously in English is wrong, fine, then tell me what you think is the correct version. Because sometimes, I mean, it's like I've been trying to do a video basically looking at the Battle of Trafalgar through the lens of the Spanish fleet that was there, because they have a very interesting point of view. At some point I'll also do one about the French, but at the moment I'm concentrating on the Spanish. And I've had to discard about 2/3 of the Spanish language books I've gotten for it, despite the fact I'm sure there's some useful information in there, because I've basically got halfway through and gone, essentially this is one long complaining fit about the way English-speaking sources represent the Battle of Trafalgar. I haven't actually learned anything about the Spanish side of Trafalgar, which is incredibly irritating, especially considering the few books I found where various Spanish historians have just gone, hey, this is the Battle of Trafalgar as we see it. They're actually really interesting, as it turns out. Cormac DM asks, why aren't tank turrets placed on ships more often? 3 main reasons. Firstly, tank turrets usually don't have anywhere near the elevation that ship turrets do, so the gun therefore cannot fire as far, so they'd have to adapt it quite heavily. Secondly, the tank turret is usually a relatively confined, close environment because it has to fit on top of a tank, which has to go places at more than like 4 miles an hour, unless you're World War I. Whereas on a ship, you tend to have a bit more space. So you want that additional space, firstly, and secondly, that additional space actually allows for things like a higher rate of fire. And thirdly, the size of the tank guns in the time period of World War I and World War II is actually pretty pathetic compared to warships, because by the time you actually get proper turreted tanks in the mainstream, you're basically talking about World War II. And what are you looking at? You know, early in the war, 40mm, 50mm, then going to 75mm, 76mm, 88, 90mm towards the end. And sure, there's a few 122mm with like the IS series and so forth. But broadly speaking, the vast majority are 75, 88mm, if we're being generous, mid to late war. You know what we call that in naval circles? We call that anti-aircraft weaponry. And not even sometimes that, because they actually, you know, that sort of between 3 and 4 inch caliber, usually and mostly towards the 3-inch end, sits in a very awkward position of being a little bit too heavy for rapid fire. That's what you have your 20mm and 40mm and occasionally 37mm for, but also a bit too small to really be a meaningful long-range anti-aircraft gun, and definitely too small to be a meaningful dual-purpose weapon. I mean, the Italians with their 90mm are a little bit of an aberration, but even then, a 90mm gun is a very big, very powerful gun, and pretty much unheard of for the majority of World War II. Yes, the Germans bring the 88mm on with the Tiger, but 90mm is slightly bigger. And trust me, if you stuck an Italian 90mm anti-aircraft gun on a tank, that would instantly become one of the most powerful tanks in the entire war. And in fact, the Italians did use 90mm AA guns on anti-aircraft mountings, pretty much the same way the Germans used the 88mm early on as an anti-tank gun. But that's obviously not in a tank turret. Even destroyers are usually, 4.5, 4.7, 5-inch, sometimes larger guns. Very occasionally 4-inch, but 4-inch is, roughly speaking, 105mm. And yeah, point me to a widespread tank with a 105mm or larger gun that was in service in mass numbers during much of World War II. And again, yes, you can point to some Russian tanks and so forth, but that then you fall back on the other two issues I pointed out in terms of elevation and the size of the turret. You can just do a lot better on a Navy ship. And then aside from those which are the more directly practical reasons in combat, there's also an environmental reason, which is that the guns used on tanks and the turrets used on tanks are designed, shockingly enough, for tanks. They're not designed for service at sea. They are not anywhere near as waterproofed as a turret would have to be for sea service, and they're also prone to rust a lot more than a sea service weapon would be. And we actually see that even today, because in a modern example, I believe the Germans tried to put the Panzer 2000 artillery unit on ships, because, hey, it's about the same caliber as a modern destroyer or frigate's gun. And in theory, like in terms of actually being a gun and being a gun-firing system, worked quite well. In terms of being a saltwater environment-proof system, not so much. And that's a pretty hefty, land-based gun. And in World War II, it would have still been seen as a fairly minimal ship-based gun. You're talking about a light cruiser-based gun, but light cruisers have 8, 10, 12, or 15 of those guns. Jerry Martin asks, why does the Montreux Convention treat aircraft carriers differently from other types of capital ship? I was under the impression that before World War II there was a lot of uncertainty and debate between carrier advocates and battleship advocates about which one was better, but the Montreux Convention goes out of its way to exempt carriers from its definition of capital ship, which allows the Black Sea powers to transit ships larger than the tonnage limit through the Strait. Was it just foresight, or is there something unique about the Black Sea-Turkish Strait that made carriers particularly a pressing concern? Going through it, I think it's pretty much more of an oversight than anything else that's blocked carriers from being able to pass through the Dardanelles, because when you look at the majority of the articles, it's basically the articles 10 through 18, they're primarily concerned about what size of warship and how many warships total from non-Black Sea powers can pass through the Dardanelles Straits. And it essentially, to me, looks like they're saying, well, what they're trying to do essentially is to go, right, non-Black Sea powers can't bring in battleships, because then, of course, that means that the Turks who have the Goeben at the time, the Russians who have some Gangut derivatives there, they will essentially still be the dominant powers in the Black Sea. Now, it does allow for a capital ship to be moved through, because essentially the limit on warships is 10,000 tons. And above that, you can bring a capital ship that exceeds 10,000 tons in, but you can only bring a maximum of 2 destroyers with you. So the way I'm reading it is essentially what the Black Sea powers are saying is, well, you can bring cruisers in, and that's fine because we have capital ships and we can kill those if you become too difficult. And if you do insist on bringing a capital ship in, we can let you do that, but you can only bring in a minimal escort, and theoretically it's still subject to the overall cap on tonnage from any given non-Black Sea navy that can enter. So essentially, yeah, you could bring a capital ship in, but you'll have virtually no escort, so at that point our submarines and destroyers can sink you. So essentially it's safeguarding the naval supremacy of the Black Sea nations. The problem with aircraft carriers, apart from the fact, obviously, in theory, it would violate the spirit of the idea of keeping the Black Sea naval powers supreme. The problem with carriers specifically stems from when it came to defining what a light surface ship was, a capital ship, etc., etc. They basically just copy and pasted the definitions of ships from the London Naval Treaties. And of course, in the London Naval Treaties and Washington Treaty that preceded them, there was a distinct interest on a global scale of splitting aircraft carriers and capital ships apart, because there were separate tonnage allowances and tonnage limitations per ship on each type. But by saying this is a capital ship, this isn't a capital ship, this is an aircraft carrier, by just porting in those naval treaty definitions, what you end up with is a slightly weird confluence in the articles of the Montreux Convention, because they're relying on those definitions. It says specifically refer to Appendix 2 for the definitions. But then the definitions are centered pretty much around surface warships, which means you're left in a position of, if a carrier is under 10,000 tons, then in theory it can come through the strait as a warship of less than 10,000 tons. But of course, no practical aircraft carrier outside of some of the early escort carriers is ever going to meet that definition. So therefore, you have aircraft carriers who weigh more than 10,000 tons, but the Articles of the Convention only allow for capital ships above 10,000 tons to come through, and the appendixes make a clear distinction between capital ships and aircraft carriers. Therefore, an aircraft carrier is a ship of war above 10,000 tons, but it is not, by the definition of the Montreux Convention, a capital ship. Therefore, there isn't actually any part of the Montreux Convention articles which allow a modern aircraft carrier to pass through. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, you mentioned that iron-hulled craft for freshwater applications had already existed for quite a while before the solution to the issue of being unable to copperplate iron-hulled ships for saltwater environments was discovered. Did anybody during this window build an iron-hulled river gunboat or river monitor, since they wouldn't be subjected to quite the same issues? And, operating off of the logic of the previous question, if the Rush-Bagot Treaty had somehow fallen through or never quite gotten around to demilitarizing the Great Lakes, what do you think the chances would have been for them to be the spot where the first iron-hulled warships would be deployed? Well, the answer to actually both of your questions is technically yes, although a very qualified yes. Inasmuch as you can see here the USS Michigan, later renamed USS Wolverine, which was an iron-hulled gunboat built in the 1840s on the Great Lakes, specifically in response to the British technically violating the Rush-Bagot Treaty by arming up a couple of steamers to deal with some rebellions in Canada in the late 1830s. And basically in response, the US went, well, if you're going to have something armed on the lakes, then so are we, and hence the Michigan, aka Wolverine, was built. There's actually still a little bit of her left in the Erie Museum on Lake Erie in the northern US, which is also where the USS Niagara is based. But more broadly speaking, iron-hulled craft before the discovery of how to properly anti-foul them as armed warships in lakes and rivers weren't particularly common, partly because iron ship technology was still relatively new. A lot of the iron-hulled freshwater craft were more barges, which are somewhat easier to build. But also, obviously, iron construction was still somewhat expensive. And to be perfectly honest, at least in the major navies, the 1830s, 1840s period didn't see all that much call for gunboats. And where it did, they were obviously going to be fairly short-lived craft for a specific emergency, at which point it was much, much easier and more economical to just knock a few together out of wood, because those could very easily be sold on afterwards or repurposed. Whereas if you went through all the time and expense of making sure you had iron manufacturing capability there and built an iron-hulled ship, operating and or selling it later on was going to be a lot more of an issue. Knights of Ni asks, sorry Drac, what measures were used to try and correct a ship's compass before the introduction of the Kelvin Spheres? So, of course, the final product was the Kelvin Spheres, which are those two big iron lumps you can see either side of this compass. However, before that, there were a few different attempts to try and correct for the influence of an iron ship on a ship's compass. Some of them were not particularly successful, but the three best measures that were found were, firstly, isolating the compass as far away as was practical from the rest of the ship. So, for example, you can see here just the invention of the compass binnacle, where the compass is in a brass container, which is non-magnetic, on a wooden plinth, also non-magnetic, on an elevated portion of the ship. So it's about as far away as you can get from the main iron mass of the ship, without taking up a mast or somewhere where it would be impractical to get to. So that was one measure which helped. Another measure which they tried was actually to use magnets to specifically counteract the magnetic influence of the iron in the ship, rather than just the big Kelvin spheres, which, as I say, came later. That, in theory, could work very well if you dialed everything in perfectly. The problem with that as a whole solution, though, was that it would work if you were only going short distances in roughly the same area, but because the Earth's magnetic field varies, both as you go further north and south, and also because it's not completely even, it also actually varies somewhat if you go east and west. Even if you dialed in the magnets to precisely correct for the influence of the ship, if you went a long distance, the magnetic field that the ship's hull was exerting would change, and then you would lose the corrections. And so the other method, which was reasonably effective but incredibly complicated, was to use what was called a standard compass and then a standard table of deviations. And there's actually a book from the late part of the 1800s, I believe it's the late 1860s, early 1870s, that goes into this in a huge amount of detail. But essentially what they'd done is they'd come up with a approximate map of the Earth's magnetic field, and then a whole massive table of pre-calculated figures that you could reference. And the idea was that you would have your standard model compass, and you would occasionally get your ship and you would turn your ship to different headings, because it's not just where your ship is in relation to the Earth's magnetic field, it's also what attitude your ship has. So is it pointing north? Is it pointing east? Is it pointing northeast, southwest, whatever? That can actually also affect the magnetic field that the ship exerts. So what you would do is you would have your compass, and you would, at your known location, presumably at the start of your voyage, you would turn your ship to face various headings and go, okay, well, let's say, for example, I know that from this anchorage, the exit of the harbour is directly east. Now, if I turn the ship to point that way, but the compass shows 87 degrees instead of 90 degrees, then I know that I have a port side deviation of 3 degrees. And then I turn it north. Maybe I know this lighthouse is directly north of me, so I know that the compass should show a bearing of 0 degrees, but the compass is perhaps showing a bearing of 1 degree. So I know at that bearing, the compass has a starboard deviation of 1 degree. And once you've done this a few times and you know what all your deviations are, you use your big table, and then you go, okay, well, in this location, applying these pre-calculated values and these particular deviations, the corrections I need to put on my compass are this. And then, because you now know roughly what the Earth's magnetic field will be doing elsewhere, as you sail along, and this is why obviously your clocks are very important, you can go, okay, well, we're now here, so now actually the compass deviation corrections need to be this. And as we continue on, they'll need to be this instead, and so on and so forth. So if you wanted to sail, let's say, dead east, as you progress at a given speed, every so often you'll be going, okay, well, the compass is currently telling us that we're heading on a course of, say, 92 degrees, but we're actually on 90 degrees. But in 6 hours' time, when the compass says we're on a course of 89 degrees, we don't need to correct 3 degrees. We only perhaps need to correct 1 degree, because that's how much it's out in that location. Which, of course, was a whole lot of work, a whole lot of calculation, and not necessarily entirely precise, because it relied on you having a standard compass, it relied on you calibrating things properly, and it relied on you being able to do some very complicated maths very quickly. And it was just much better to use the Kelvin spheres later on. Scott Mason asks, I was watching an episode of Tony Robinson's Time Team a few weeks ago, and they were looking at King Henry V's flagship, which had been mud-berthed in an English river. So I was curious, in the episode it seemed like it was completed, then just left to rot without seeing any action. Why did they do this? It seems like it would have been a very impressive vessel, and I would have thought the king would have at least used it for prestige, if nothing else. Also, how often were ships mud-berthed, and when did this go out of fashion? I'm assuming that ships of the line were a bit too big. So mud-berthing was essentially a way of keeping the ship basically in storage. So you might think of it as dry docking in a period before dry docks. So that kind of answers part of the question. It went out of fashion because you could use dry docks, but also ships generally started to get a little bit too large, because mud berthing was very useful if you had a tidal river where you could take a ship upriver at a particularly high tide and put it in very, very, well, not shallow water, but shallow relative to the ship's draft. And then as the river resumed its more normal level, the ship would be essentially stuck in the mud, except on very rare instances where it floated off because of a particularly high tide, and you could manage that. Now, that's great for smaller ships. Larger ships, you probably couldn't get them up the river in the first place. If you could, they'd probably block a significant portion of the river, and as ships also got larger, they didn't tend to do so well with being exposed out of the water for such long periods, especially when you move on to carvel build as opposed to clinker building because of timber shrinkage and so forth. Now, in terms of the Grace Dieu, which is the particular ship in question, this all goes back to the period when the country was essentially run as a private enterprise, and this applies to pretty much all medieval nations at the time, for the most part, because the king ran the country, yes. However, what the king did to run the country, if he wanted to have an army, a standing army of some sort, as opposed to just a feudal levy, if you wanted to have a fleet, etc., this wasn't a state-owned asset. This was a privately owned asset, owned specifically by that king, not even the royal family, by that individual. So in this case, the Grace Dieu was built for Henry V, but as it turned out, it was completed shortly before Henry V died. He wasn't expected to die that early, to be fair, but he had gone through a very expensive series of wars with France, including the campaign that, led up to the Battle of Agincourt and so forth. And so when he died, theoretically, his assets passed to his son, Henry VI. But one, Henry VI wasn't a particularly brilliant king generally. Two, at the time, he was a child, so there was a regency. And three, when somebody dies, obviously creditors, people that the person owes money to, can get first call on various debts. And well, if the fleet happens to be a private asset of the king and the king owes a bunch of people money, then the fleet can be sold off to pay those debts. And even if this big prestige vessel like the Grace Dieu isn't necessarily sold off immediately, well, keeping a ship essentially high and dry in storage is a lot cheaper than keeping it running and in active service. So if you've inherited a bunch of stuff from your dad, if you're Henry VI, and a ton of it has been sold off immediately to pay for his debts, and you have a small amount left, including this socking great ship, but this massive great ship is going to cost you an absolute fortune to run, and you don't really need it at that point because, well, the French aren't really sailing in huge numbers in the Channel. Well, you just keep it in storage until such time as you need it. And then it turns out that it got hit by lightning and burned to the ground. And now it's a wreck. Edward Dunn asks, in Pirates of the Caribbean 3 at World's End, Jack Sparrow and the crew of the Black Pearl managed to capsize the ship by rocking the ship from side to side by running across the deck, as well as loosening the guns and cargo. Is this actually possible to do? Theoretically, yes, it actually is. Cargo shifting, causing a ship to heel over and sink if it's not properly secured, was actually a major danger in the Age of Sail for ships travelling through the oceans, and in fact even past the Age of Sail. If you have unsecure cargo and you hit rough seas, that could very well be the end of your ship. And you can see here, because I don't want to get sued by Disney, this is the Emperor of India in the World War I period, and she's undergoing what's called an inclination test. Now, in more modern periods, and to be fair, even in this period, inclination tests were usually done by putting heavy weights, usually water-filled tanks or something like that, on one side of the ship. And as you can see, it can induce quite a significant heel. But in older times, the inclination test could be done by just having all the crew stand on one side of the ship. That partly exploited the fact that there were proportionally a lot more crew relative to the size of a ship in the old days as compared to the age of dreadnoughts. Because bear in mind, the crew of a first rate like HMS Victory might give you a weight of 80 to 100 tons, and if you put 80 to 100 tons on one side of the ship and not the other, on a ship that only displaces, well, in Victory's case, a couple of thousand tons, a few thousand tons, and in the case of a smaller ship of the line, maybe even high hundreds, low thousand tons, yeah, a weight like that high up could cause a significant heel. With Pirates of the Caribbean 3, obviously the Black Pearl is smaller and the crew is much smaller, but loosening the guns, yeah, that's going to be a bit of an issue. Ostensibly, the Black Pearl is armed with 12-pounder guns, which means you're talking about a 1.5 to 2 ton weight per gun, and she's supposed to have, again, these are very notional, but supposed to have 32 of those guns. So just in and of itself, you're talking about 50 to 60 tons of guns, maybe going up to about 65 tons if you include the crew, not accounting for the cargo. And given that she's about the size of a fifth-rate frigate, yeah, that could cause her to keel over. And of course, in the film, they're also actually, rather cleverly, I think, using resonance to build that up. So, I mean, some parts of it are a little bit unrealistic. If you had the whole ship's armament crashing back and forth below decks the way that you see it in the film, it would have probably burst the size of the ship before long. But in general, the idea of getting up an initial resonance using the crew and then cutting loose the cargo and the guns, yeah, that probably would have capsized the ship, and probably, in the swing immediately after you cut everything loose. Now, you wouldn't go completely upside down the way the Black Pearl does, you just end up on your side rapidly filling with water, but there's a reason you have to lash the cargo down. Scott Giles asks, could you discuss the failure of level bombing to be anywhere near as effective as hoped in the mid-war or interwar period? Once there were guns in place to shoot down low-flying planes, it stopped working, and even against stationary targets they needed up to 1,000 planes at 20,000 feet to hit what half a dozen could hit at low levels, and hitting moving ships became something of a joke. The basic problem with level bombing ships is that the calculations necessary really pretty much assume kind of spherical cow in a vacuum perfect conditions. It doesn't account for things like the wind. Now, of course, you might be able to account for the wind by looking at the way the ship's funnel smoke is going, or by what your own indicators are showing where you are. But the problem is, if you're dropping anything meaningful, i.e. a big AP bomb, you need to be at a relatively decent altitude. I mean, sure, you can drop general purpose bombs at low altitude, but one, you're likely to get shot down, and two, probably not going to do all that much damage. But you need a bomb to accelerate to a decent speed to actually do a reasonable amount of damage, and of course, being at higher altitude tends to keep you safer as well. So, level bombing would tend to take place at higher altitudes. And the thing is, not only are you making guesstimates of what the wind speed is where you are and what the wind speed and direction is where the ship is, you can't really compensate for what the wind speed is in between those points, or even what direction the wind might be, because the wind can not only just change speed but also direction at several layers of the atmosphere, and all of that might well blow the bomb off course, even if your initial drop was accurate and the ability to target something even as large as a ship accurately from thousands of feet up in the air in the interwar period and even in World War II really wasn't there. Yes, the Norden bomb sight existed towards the end of the interwar period, but it really was not in any way, shape or form anywhere as close to accurate as its makers claimed it to be. And the other fundamental problem was, well, the people being bombed usually have a motivation not to get hit by the bombs. And thanks to a combination of initial acceleration and so forth, and just terminal velocity, generally speaking, it took around about 30 seconds for level bombing bombs that were dropped to actually hit the water. If you're dropping from 5,000 feet, that'd be a little bit less, and if you're dropping from 15,000 plus feet, it'd be a bit more, but broadly speaking, you'd have somewhere between 25 and 35 seconds, give or take a little bit, before the bombs hit. And what you see multiple accounts of from ships that came under bombing attacks during World War II was quite simply, you'd have a bunch of guys up on the bridge with binoculars watching the aircraft as they dropped their bombs, and then you could take advantage of a little quirk of physics. And that is, if something is on a collision course with you, so you have two moving objects, in this case a ship and a bomb, but this applies to pretty much anything really, assuming that both objects are travelling in, roughly speaking, straight lines. Now, of course, bombs are travelling on a very slight arc because they're dropped with forward velocity, but near enough as makes no difference. They're travelling roughly in a diagonal, but therefore straight line. If you, as the observer on one of those objects, sees the other object, and the other object doesn't appear to be moving in any of the dimensions other than it's just getting bigger, so it's not moving horizontally or vertically in your plane of view, that actually means you're on a collision course. So if you are watching the bombs and you're looking at the bombs and you see the bombs falling, and instead of looking essentially at the noses of the bombs, you're seeing a side profile view of the bombs, or you're having to track because the bombs are tracking across your field of view, you don't have to worry because those bombs are not going to hit you. And they might come uncomfortably close, so if the rate of change is small, you might still want to evade. But essentially, what those observers are looking for is, these bombs just appear to be getting larger and larger and larger in my field of view. That means they're going to hit, or be very, very close. That means we should steer to evade. And, of course, if you have 20, 30, 35, 40 seconds to evade, and the observers are very quickly saying, yep, we need to steer, then you put the wheel over, and in that time, the ship can change course quite a bit. And, you know, if it's several hundred feet away from where it would otherwise have been, those bombs are not going to hit. So, and obviously the observers will go, oh yeah, now the bombs are moving. Now they're clearly going to miss. This is a good thing. And it makes it basically impossible to hit with level bombing unless you completely saturate an area, which requires massive numbers of aircraft, and even then it's not necessarily guaranteed. So you can see here from the early stage of the Battle of Midway, this is the Hiryu. Now if you look at where her wake is at the bottom of the picture, you can see that the blasts from the bombs dropped by the B-17s that were trying to level bomb her actually weren't too bad. I mean, the ones on the furthest left of that set of bombs probably would have at least been near misses, if not potentially hits. But again, the observers have done their job. Hiryu has steered to port, and now she's several hundred feet further to the left, and the bombs have missed entirely, which essentially meant that outside of spectacularly bad luck, if you were going to be hit by level bombing as a ship, it meant you were either going to have to be stationary or didn't change course in the slightest. And most people who are under bomb attacks don't tend to fit those two categories. Scale Model Apprentice asks, what will be the first museum ship you'll introduce Mini-Drach to? And is there one that you'd like to visit first for any particular reason? Yes, it will be, if I have anything to say about it, HMS Victory. Partly because it's one of the closer museum ships. I mean, yeah, Belfast is closer, but that involves going into central London. And also because that's where I started at a very, very, very young age. And in fact, I actually still have photos that I took with a little disposable camera of my first visit to HMS Victory way back in the previous millennium. So, yeah, if I've got anything to do with it, Mini-Drach's first experience of a museum ship shall be a tour of HMS Victory.
Dr. D.M. Platt asks, what question from Season 1 of the Drydock do you want to re-answer now due to knowing much more? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Occasionally questions will come up that I know I've answered before, and sometimes I'll look at them and go, ooh, actually, I can add more detail to this, or I can maybe slightly correct something that I said before, and then I'll just have those put in the Drydock anyway. So I guess in some ways I'm already doing that. I don't think there's anything that particularly stands out to me, but I think if there was a general pattern of question from the early Drydocks, which maybe I'd choose to answer again now, it would be less questions on what, because technical knowledge, I think is going to be pretty similar. But I think I would perhaps answer some questions slightly differently when it comes to the why of things. Specifically because as I've been able to do this as a full-time job and therefore broaden the scope of my research even more, I've been able to look at not just texts that tell you this is how many guns something had, this is how fast it could go, this is how well protected it was. I've also been able to delve much, much deeper into the why of things. Why did they choose this gun over this gun? Why was this engine selected when this other much better one was available? Why did they think that this was a good idea in the first place? And so on and so forth. And that's, really a little bit of a deeper level of understanding. Now, obviously, even back when you had Season 1 of the Drydock, I still had answers to why certain things were done to a certain degree. But inevitably, the more research you do, the more and more you see things being connected. And it's also, I think, in that area where you come across little bits which you end up going, oh, hang on a minute. While the common view on why is technically correct, perhaps it's needing to be supplemented by quite a strong additional piece of information that most people don't usually consider. Texas and LaShock asks, is it true that the CIC, or Command and Information Control Center, was inspired by the Lensman series of E. E. Smith, and are there any other instances of fictional works inspiring naval innovation? I don't think the CIC and Lensman connection thing is really true, because although one of the officers involved in developing early CICs was a known reader of the Lensman series, he wasn't the only officer involved. And when you look at the development of the early CICs on various US Navy ships, they're a little bit all over the place. You have some which are deeper in the ship. You have some, like the one that Admiral Lee instituted, which are right behind the bridge, even on a battleship, which actually has armor that makes putting a CIC deeper in the ship worth it. The layouts are all different, and there's only really a general similarity between the kind of structure described in the Lensman series and CIC. They coordinate and correlate lots of information to give you an overall better picture of a battle. But something in that way, shape, or form, even if it's right down to just a set of maps and messengers in a general's tent in a Napoleonic era battle, has always existed in some way, shape, or form. It's just that the Lensman one and CIC, as it would be known in the US Navy, was pretty much both dealing with large amounts of electronic data input, which hadn't previously been present or in such volumes. But it also neglects the fact that CIC-alike chambers, or rooms, if you like, were being developed in other navies at the same time, or perhaps even earlier than the US CIC. So the British were using a similar kind of room initially for the direction of air defense, both in coordination of fighters, spotting incoming enemy aircraft, and then obviously directing the fighters to them, coordinating strikes, and of course the actual gunfire, who should be going where to target what with their guns. And when the US enters the war, obviously on the side of the UK, then you have a cross-pollinization process going on where British design adopts some of the better qualities of American CICs, but American CICs also adopt some of the better qualities of British designs. And so the CIC that emerges at the end of World War II, I would argue, is not the creation of any one person. It's not even the creation of any one navy. It's a fusion of multiple different people's efforts from multiple different navies combined with wartime experience. Now, as far as other fictional works inspiring naval innovation, for the time period the channel covers, I'm not immediately aware of any significant naval innovation that you can point to and say, here, this was deliberately and directly inspired by this fictional writing. In part because, well, there just wasn't as much fictional writing in the time period the channel covers as there would be in the post-World War II period. And secondly, a lot of fictional writing at the time would either involve basically using the existing time period as a setting, or it would involve some unspecified, sort of 5 minutes into the future technology that was just a bigger and better version of what they already had, which isn't exactly inspiration. That's just kind of, well, fairly logical that that might arise. Or it goes, completely off the wall in terms of current capability. So essentially becoming a kind of period science fiction. And that's where you would get things like, say, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and so forth. But you can't really say that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, for example, inspired modern submarine warfare because, well, as we've seen over various videos on the channel, the idea of getting a war vessel underwater was something that had occupied people's minds for a very, very long time before that. And in actual fact, at the time that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is written, there are actually more effective weapons than just ramming an enemy ship already in service in the form of torpedoes. Ian Carr asks, Admiral Wemyss' progress through the Royal Navy's hierarchy during World War I seems extraordinary. How did he progress without experience in the Grand Fleet, and did he have a particular mentor, or was he widely recognised as a talent? Well, it's a combination of things, I think. Wemyss had friends in high places, it must be said. Early on in his career, he was family friends with Rear Admiral Beresford, so until Fisher won that particular catfight, he had a friend in high places. But he was also fairly well connected with the royal family, which certainly couldn't have hurt his prospects. But you have to bear in mind that on top of that, Wemyss does seem to have been a fairly talented officer. Now, granted, he wasn't top of his class in his early years of service, but as he attended various courses and so forth as he went up the career ladder, he did tend to edge higher and higher towards the top of those classes, which I would argue is perhaps a more practical reflection of his ongoing development as a career naval officer. And when he was given various tasks, both before and during the war, he generally seems to have accomplished them very well. I mean, he was one of the relatively few high-ranking officers to come out of Gallipoli, of all things, with his star actually somewhat on the rise, because while the overall Gallipoli campaign obviously, let's just say, didn't go very well, the bits that he was directly involved with actually did go pretty well, and there were plenty of independent letters of commendation about his conduct during that campaign and what he'd accomplished. And to a certain degree, I'd argue that potentially he even had a bit of an advantage of not being in the Grand Fleet, because it meant that he was, as I said, a relatively talented officer with a decent number of connections who could highlight when he did well. And by not being in the Grand Fleet, which, as we know, spent most of its time waiting for the High Seas Fleet to come out, he was actually able to get on with a lot more individual separate actions and accomplishments, which, of course, could then all be highlighted in his career profile to allow him to be advanced further, as opposed to an officer of similar rank in the Grand Fleet who might get a big feather in his cap for what he did at Jutland, but for the 2 or 3 years he might otherwise have been with the Grand Fleet, isn't really going to have much on his service record other than maybe some efficiency and gunnery marks in his copybook. Michael Williams asks, you've mentioned before that you're a fan of the film Master and Commander. One thing that did surprise me in the film was that the British ship is caught unprepared when the French ship attacks out of the fog. It was my understanding that in wartime the crew greeted the dawn at action stations to be ready for such an attack when visibility returned. Is that not the case? That's generally the case in World War I and World War II, certainly. You would have the crew at action stations either at dawn or half an hour before dawn, depending on the account and the ship, specifically because there was a risk of coming under attack as the sun rose. However, it's my understanding that this was not standard procedure back in the Age of Sail, which is the time when Master and Commander is set, in large part just due to the pace of naval warfare, because obviously in World War I, World War II, whether it be a surface attack or air attack or whatever, given the range of weapons, it was entirely possible that an enemy might be within range of you, perhaps even having spotted you using some advantage that they had, and ready to attack as soon as light allowed them to range properly, and you might not be in a position to spot them in return. Or if they are out of range, then they might be able to close that range pretty quickly using, obviously, the power of modern steam machinery. Whereas in the Age of Sail, the range of guns was much, 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 much closer, at which point, outside of a handful of circumstances, the chances of an opponent either getting to within gun range and then waiting for the dawn, if you have two different ships at sea, or perhaps being close enough to quickly dart into gun range, is fairly minimal, and therefore it most likely isn't going to be standard procedure every single day aboard a Royal Navy ship, a French ship, a Spanish ship, or whatever. Because honestly, if a ship got that close, then you're talking about a range at which you'd probably be able to hear the enemy ship, either in form of hear people moving about, hear the creak of their sails. The sails themselves would also be fairly easy to spot, especially in pre-dawn light. And in those kinds of circumstances, you could beat to quarters pretty darn quickly. Now, the situation in Master and Commander is somewhat unique in that you've got this fog that's developed, which is vastly limiting, but in theory, that's vastly limiting to both sides, which would mean outside of exceptional circumstances, if you did stumble across an enemy, they should be as surprised as you. Of course, one of the major points of this whole opening section of Master and Commander is to do with whether or not the midshipmen are actually ready to spot the Acheron and make the call to beat to quarters in time. It's a very, very close run thing, obviously. But also the Acheron is given this kind of, not quite, but almost supernatural sixth sense about how to find the surprise, when by most standards, the Acheron should have been much easier to spot than the Surprise was. But, a very well-crewed ship with a lot of intelligence about the enemy's movements might be able to pull off something like Acheron does. Alex Moskowitz asks, from 1900-ish onwards, where did ship's pets generally hang out? Given the trouble I have tracing around a HMS Belfast, I can't imagine them taking the stairs all that often. Well, you've got to consider what kind of pets you'd be talking about. The most common ship's pets, of course, could be cats and dogs, and perhaps a secondary lesser line in birds and things like monkeys. Now, of course, monkeys are very good at climbing, probably much better than the ship's crew, so they're not going to have a problem going up and down stairs and ropes and ladders and so forth. Birds obviously can fly, so they're not going to have too much of a problem as long as there's space for them to fly through. And cats, well, anyone who's seen a house cat jumping around knows that cats can clear fairly high distances just leaping, and they're usually not half bad climbers either. So a cat wouldn't have too many problems negotiating the majority of early 20th century warships. The only ones who might struggle a little bit would be dogs, but even then it depends on the kind of dog, bearing in mind that a lot of ships' pets weren't just mascots. They usually did have a practical application, like hunting down the ship's rat population, and the best dogs for ratting tend to be small, agile dogs like terriers and so forth, and indeed you do see that in photos of ships' mascots. Most of the time, if the ship's mascot is a dog, they tend to be on the smaller, nippier side. Now, even then, getting up some of the ladders, that might well be within their capabilities. Getting down might be a little bit more difficult, but then they would probably be kept mostly on a given deck or decks, so the crew would give them a hand where necessary. And to be perfectly honest, if you have a ship's pet that can't very easily scale the ladders up and down, which would be the larger of the small dogs and perhaps medium-sized dogs as well, it's probably just as well that they can't, because that is indicative of other things in terms of agility and grip, at which point you probably want them to stay, roughly speaking, on the deck you put them on, because hopefully they'll be safe there, as opposed to perhaps out in the open, uncontrolled, where they might end up going over the side. Whereas something like a cat with very, very good grip, and of course retractable claws and such, is much less likely to go over the side if it happens to wander up onto the upper decks for a bit of a sunbathe. And finally, for this week, the Rogue Chief asks, I've read that Dreadnought's mast was positioned behind the funnel because the design was so rushed they overlooked the problems this would cause. Is this really the case, or was there a reason for the decision, such as for the boat cranes you discussed in a previous dry dock? And what, in your opinion, is the most dramatic engineering example of, yeah, we really didn't think that one through, did we? So looking at HMS Dreadnought first, via this incredibly famous picture of her, yeah, the funnel and the mast positioning is not a product of her being a massively rushed design. You know, if she was a massively rushed design, to the extent that this kind of mistake could be made just because they're quickly slapping things together, then by all rights, she should have actually had her mast forward of the funnel, because if you look at, well, pretty much every British pre-Dreadnought class leading up to her, they all have their foremast forward of the funnel. In actual fact, if you look at the design documentation for Dreadnought, the placement and type of mast, it going from a pole to a tripod, and then its obviously location behind the funnel, seems to have been almost entirely predicated on how it could interact with the boat derrick in order to allow the ship's boats to be lifted on and off easily without having to require additional weight. So they did look at having the mast, the foremast forward of the funnel, but then they would need an entirely separate crane aft of the funnel, that's the forward funnel, to move the boats around, because you couldn't have the boats too far forward, because, well, you can see that a wing 12-inch gun blast might well cause problems with that. And so moving it behind, well, that solved a lot of problems. It saved weight, it saved space, and it was calculated that because they thought, well, you know, when Dreadnought's moving at 20-21 knots, then the smoke and the heat from the funnel will be whipped back quite significantly, as you can actually kind of see happening in this picture. They thought, oh, well, in that case, then the problematic exhaust gases and everything will be swept past and below and away from the spotting top, so it won't matter too much that it's behind. Now, of course, in practice, this turned out not to be the case and was the cause of many problems, but they had thought about the problem and had thought that it wasn't going to be a problem. It wasn't just that they stuck it behind the funnel and went, oh, well, you know, if the people in the spotting top get roasted, that's not our problem. Although you can also make the argument that perhaps they should have anticipated the problem a little bit more. And you can actually see in this picture, as we've zoomed in, there's one of the boat derricks secured with lines to the tripod mast. Now, in terms of dramatic engineering examples of not really thinking that one through, I pretty much am always going to fall back to the Indefatigable class battle cruisers, because that is probably one of the most egregious examples of not seeing the wood for the trees. Just letting one particular fixation run away with an idea. Because as I've covered extensively in one of my naval engineering disasters videos, simply put, you have the Invincible class. It has 6-inch belt armor. This is perfectly adequate for fighting pretty much any armored cruiser in existence at ranges preferable to the Invincible's 12-inch guns. Great, fantastic. Can it stop an 11 or 12-inch shell? Not really. Is it meant to? No, because it's not supposed to fight in the battle line. That's kind of added on as a later thing, and even then, when the consideration is kind of incorporated into the mission statement for the Invincible class, it's still in the form of, well, they'll run ahead of the battle fleet and cross the T of the enemy battle line, which by inference will be occupied fighting the rest of the British battle line, so they're not going to come under fire. And they'll be doing this at high speed and long range, and at least in those circumstances, while the 6-inch belt might not stop an 11 or 12-inch shell, it should at least slow it down and initiate it enough that the shell, even if it explodes inside the ship, won't get all the way to the magazines. With the Indefatigables, having seen some of the issues with cross-deck firing on the Invincibles, they lengthened the design, keeping, roughly speaking, the same armament, mostly just in an attempt to get better cross-deck firing. And then they realised, well, hang on a minute, make hull bigger, ship gets heavier, so we must save weight. Well, how do we save weight? Well, how have we saved weight in the past? Well, we've thinned out armour in the past. Okay, fine, we'll thin out armour here. Except for the fact that in almost all other circumstances where armour has been thinned out, the arm, at least in British ships of that period, the armour had been built heavily enough to take a battering at the expected battle range and a little bit closer as a bit of insurance. And then if you went, okay, well, we need to save weight on a subsequent design, well, can we shave an inch or two here or there? The armour on a capital ship was generally a lot heavier, so proportionally shaving an inch or two off wasn't as massive a percentage reduction. And secondly, because of that aforementioned sort of safety margin that was built in, you would end up with, okay, well, this ship perhaps can't fight at this range that can, like its predecessor could, but it can still fight across most of the expected battle range. It'll just be a little bit more vulnerable at the closer ones. Whereas with the Indefatigables, well, the Invincible's armour belt was just adequate to fight at the ranges it wanted to fight at. And when you did a reduction, as they did, reducing the 6-inch to 4-inch abreast the fore and aft magazines, then not only was this a 33% reduction in overall armour thickness, as opposed to an 8 or 9% reduction, which it might have been on an actual battleship, but it also then took the resistance of the belt armour not only down to a point where an 11 or 12-inch shell would sail merrily through it and onwards into the magazines with almost no effect on the shell, but it also reduced the belt armour to a thickness below which it couldn't actually resist a lot of the heavier armoured cruiser guns, 7.5, 8.2, 8.3, 9.2 inch, etc., that were floating around in the world, which had then eliminated the entire point of the battle cruiser, which was essentially to be able to safely engage an armoured cruiser at a range where it in itself could not be harmed. You just now made a very heavily armed but thoroughly inadequately armoured fast armoured cruiser that could nonetheless be taken out by a ship much smaller and slower and less well armed than it, because it had now pretty terrible belt armour over some of its magazines, even for an armoured cruiser, let alone a battle cruiser. And, well, that was rather dramatically proved by poor old Indefatigable herself at Jutland. And that brings us to an end for this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. As I mentioned in previous Drydock, I have changed my audio setup now, so over the next few weeks, possibly a couple of months, you might hear audio background noise and levels jump a little bit in and out, because I obviously have some videos already recorded, at least as far as the audio is concerned, so they'll still have the audio of the previous microphone, whereas other videos will have either a section or the entirety recorded using the new audio setup, and I'm still playing around with the new audio setup to optimize the settings perfectly. But hopefully the era of too quiet dry docks with a lot of background noise is now over. In any way, hope to see you again in another video.